Yeah, Kylian Mbappe, it's great to have him. He has a huge reach. What we've been very careful to do is for these things not to just be marketing stunts. Once upon a time, sailing, the hospitality boats had to sail off an hour before the race to go and watch it miles offshore. But very much our races are close to shore stadium racing.
There's the team sales, there's maybe host cities paying some sort of fee to host in certain markets. But one that stood out because of a couple of announcements that you've made is the sponsorship side of things.
We understand we have a responsibility to uphold those brand values of Rolex, but I think that pushes us on quite nicely as an organization.
One element of the franchise model that really increases the value of them is the scarcity, right? So is there some sort of reassurance with the current team owners that it won't go above a certain number?
I think we're averaging about 25 million dedicated viewers, linear and digital, for each race. But now it's time for us to kick on from there.
Hello and welcome to the Sports Pundit podcast, the show exclusively for the people shaping the future of sport. Driven by my curiosity working within the industry, I started this show to host conversations with decision makers from the MLB to the ICC, unpacking their strategies and industry shaping ideas. On today's episode, I'm joined by Andy Thompson, Managing Director at SailGP, an international sailing competition where teams compete across a season of multiple Grand Prix around the world, in cities like New York, Sydney, San Francisco, and Portsmouth. Andy's career spans the likes of Deloitte, London 2012, and the America's Cup, where he was first introduced to both Sailing and SailGP founders Larry Ellison and Russell Coutts, who aspired to create a commercially viable sailing series. In this conversation, we discuss Andy's journey, as well as the journey of this upstart league, which was only founded in 2019, but now finds itself with 13 races and 12 teams, with owners like Ben Ainsley and Kylian Mbappe, and blue chip sponsors like Emirates, Accor, and Rolex. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Andy Thompson.
Thanks for having me, Andy. Great to be here.
Welcome to the podcast. Where I like to start every episode is just to get a little bit of an understanding of your personal journey.
Yeah, see how far we want to go back here. But yeah, certainly growing up around football, around cricket, kind of sports mad kid growing up. And, everyone's dream is to be an athlete and, be a professional athlete. And, you kind of had that realization, or certainly I did probably earlier than most, that wasn't going to be the case. So, I kind of then, kind of did well at school. I was kind of brought up in Wolverhampton in the Midlands, and then went to Leeds University from there. And at that point, I kind of thought, what do I want to do? As I think most kind of university students do. And yeah, I think, in the early noughties, I think the sports industry was starting to grow in the UK. And I kind of thought, well, how do I get into that? Because that sounds like fun. And certainly with my background, there wasn't a lot of doors open to me, was kind of my maybe cynical view at that point. And so, yeah, I was fortunate enough to land a graduate job at Deloitte in London. I think that did two things for me. It was very much kind of gave me a grounding in a profession, in accountancy, but it also kind of gave me an overview of what, some major blue chip companies, how they operate. But also, I got some really good experience with some sports clients there. People ask me pretty regularly, what's your advice to get into the sports industry? And certainly my advice is, it's not just magically going to happen. My advice is, certainly at the start of your career, find a profession that you like, that has some kind of relevance to sport, whether it be a finance or legal or marketing, communications, or event management, or engineering for that matter. And then from there, kind of find your pathway in. So that was kind of the start of my career. It was some crazy years in London, and then I got the opportunity to move to London 2012 Olympics via a secondment with Deloitte, and that was, I guess, my first big sports role. Really learn how a large organization should be run, and learn from some real inspirational leaders there. I say large organization. By the time the games happened, that organization was 6,000 people. And so, we grew that organization. And then, learned how to manage big project budgets. At that point, I was working in the finance team there. Yeah, the budget was, I think at the time, 2.5 billion pounds. And yeah, it was, of course, there were some challenges with the games, but all in all, it was, a successful Olympics. Well, I think one of the things I was probably most proud of that games, which is probably not spoke about too much is, I actually stayed after the games for another year, kind of almost tidying up the games, if you like. And I think that was done in a good fashion. You can have an opinion about the legacy of the London Olympics, but we kind of had some horror stories of, Atlanta in the 90s that, they're still fighting lawsuits 30 years on. I think the people of Montreal were still paying for those Olympics up until pretty recently. So that was something that we were trying to avoid. And I think we did that pretty well. I think it was, kind of tied it up in a really well done fashion and handed over to the LLDC in the right way in a pretty short period of time. So for me, that was, I guess, my first big introduction into the sports world. I think, a lot of people in the UK sports industry, that was a big moment. And, kind of a lot of people have gone to significant careers off the back of that. I then went to Perform Group, which is now DAZN, in the New York office. They just kind of started their kind of America's business. Again, very much learning from some really inspirational leaders there too. But for me, it was really understanding how the US sports industry works. And, there's some significant differences between the European sports industry and the US sports industry. So he's a much more, I guess, entrepreneurial and commercial environment there. So, that was a huge learning curve for me for a couple of years in New York and Carolina. So, and then then had the opportunity to work for the America's Cup as a CFO. That's almost 10 years ago. Just so happened it was in Bermuda, which was kind of a nice move for my wife and I at the time. So yeah, that was my first introduction into the world of sailing. It was the first time working for Russell Coutts, our CEO, and Larry Ellison, our owner. I think my first impression there was how commercially minded Russell was and Larry was, and how much they had a vision for the sport of sailing. And that was abundantly clear straight away. Now, shortly thereafter, I also realized that, oh my God, the governance of the America's Cup is quite a challenge, let's just say. And, there were, teams almost like actively working against the kind of organizing committee, so to speak. And yeah, I was fresh coming into it. And I kind of, my view was like, wow, this isn't a huge sport right now in the world. And almost like everyone's fighting against each other to get their piece of the pie, I guess. And yeah, certainly for me, I was like, wow, why aren't we all pulling in the same direction to take sailing more mainstream? And kind of my kind of thoughts on that was, well, the competition is out there; it's not inside the sailing industry. But it just built up over years. So I guess that was really the kind of genesis of SailGP in a way, and that event itself, that Bermuda America's Cup, was commercially profitable, which in a way was a proof of concept that sailing as a sports property could work. And so, yeah, from there, pretty much straight away after 2017, I actually, the America's Cup had happened, and I was actually looking forward to 6 months on the beach, just chilling out. We were also expecting our first baby at the time. And yeah, Russell called me and said, "Hey, we're going to start something else." And I was like, "Okay, well, that's interesting." He said, "Yeah, Larry wants a commercial model in 2 days." Uh, so yeah, my kind of holiday plans were scuppered somewhat there, and yeah, kind of that was 2017, and here we are 8 years later. And yeah, kind of as managing director of SailGP, it's been quite a ride, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those ups and downs as we get into this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a number of things we could touch on from what you just shared. I think initially, I guess, making that transition from sort of a big consultancy firm like Deloitte into sport, I'm curious on two fronts. One is kind of working with sports properties versus working with non-sports properties, and kind of if there was stuff you're able to take from outside of sport that you think is potentially valuable for sports properties. Because I think sometimes sport broadly has an issue of being quite insular and only really looking at itself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's a good point. I think what I took from it was that sports rights holders or sports teams in general, and not actually big businesses. Outside of, the Formula Ones and NFLs of this world, kind of working with major corporates kind of really gave me, I'd say, a understanding of how to operate big businesses, but at the same time, also the pitfalls of committees and bureaucracies within major companies. And I think far too often in the sports industry, there's lots of committees and there's lots of, kind of people and hoops that you have to jump through. And certainly one of the mantras that we have at SailGP is, kind of we make decisions quickly. And yes, we want to understand people's viewpoints, but, we can't be stuck in committees kind of trying to get things through. So, yeah, it was a good grounding, I'd say. And, you almost like take the best bits from major corporates and try and emulate them in sports business. But as I say, you almost like don't want to go too far because then you kind of get yourself into kind of a bureaucratic soup in a way.
Yeah. In terms of that ability to move fast within SailGP,
Yeah.
is one big advantage of that it's a new sports property, and so you haven't kind of almost graduated from amateur sports league with all of this legacy and history and policy and politics already attached into a
Yeah.
professional sport.
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of have a rule at SailGP, no committees. Um, and that means that we can make agile decisions. And yes, we're sanctioned by World Sailing, which have been a fantastic governing body for us. But very much they say you're doing a great job, get on with it, so to speak. So yeah, it's certainly coming from a world where we were in the America's Cup and coming to a world of SailGP. You don't have tons of stakeholders, and it just makes things so much easier to make decisions. And yeah, I think as we're growing as an organization, there's obviously more complexity to it for sure. And that, now we have, teams owned by third parties, for example, that, that's something that we have to work with for sure. But, we certainly feel like we're able to kind of move on very quickly without all those historical, I guess, processes that are in place in other organizations for sure.
Yeah. Before we dive in a little bit more in depth, it might be worth just explaining two things. One would be explaining who Russell and Larry are for people that maybe aren't familiar, and what their kind of impact within the sport of sailing and interest in sailing is. And then the second part would be to explain what SailGP is for those that are maybe less familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. You're asking me to explain my bosses here, so I need to be very careful in how I answer this one. But look, so Larry Ellison is the co-founder of Oracle Corporation, as a major shareholder of that corporation, and is a hugely successful businessman. He's from the US. He's had a passion for sailing for many years, and got into the America's Cup, I think, in the late 90s, early noughties, kind of really wanting to change the sport in many ways, and was successful in winning the America's Cup for Oracle Team USA in 2010. And then that led to the America's Cup in San Francisco in 2013 and 2017 and thereafter. I think, certainly Larry's vision was how to kind of turn sailing into a made for TV product. And that was the genesis of Liveline, which, if you're not familiar with LGP, and I'll come on to that shortly, but Liveline is our kind of graphical overlay that shows the field of play and shows the speeds of the boats and kind of the positions of the boats. It's not always obvious in sailing where that is. And I think Liveline in kind of 2010, 2011 was an absolute game changer for that. It also meant that we could commercialize the boundaries as well around the course. And yeah, that was certainly Larry driving that. And so, yeah, he's super passionate about this sport. He sees the growth of SailGP and he's hugely supportive of what we've been doing. And Russell Coutts is our CEO. So Russell is, you probably won't mind me saying this, is the most decorated sailor of all time. He won gold medal in the 84 Olympics. He won't thank me for saying that because that kind of dates him. But since then has been very successful running America's Cup syndicates. And yeah, I mean, he's won the America's Cup 5 times. He's actually never, here's a stat, he's never lost an America's Cup match race. So he's won it 4-0 or 5-0 or what have you, which is well while he's been on the boat. So that's that shows his mentality, let's just say.
Mhm.
And yeah, he's been a visionary in this sport in that he certainly wants to bring this sport to more people and kind of I guess sees the future of the sport of how do we give a commercially sustainable platform that will live long on after we've all gone, and is kind of like all the other sports have. They have the elite end of the sport, and sailing's never really had that. I'm sure we'll come on to that, but yeah, he's been a huge proponent of that, and yeah, it's certainly his vision and drive that have put this organization into the place we are today.
Yeah.
So answering the second part of your question, what is SailGP? Probably should have started the other way around, but anyway, SailGP in a nutshell is Grand Prix racing on water. We're in our 5th season now. We have 13 events in iconic global locations. We have 12 international teams competing at the moment on identical foiling catamarans. That's very important for SailGP that the boats are all the same. They're all one design. That kind of maintains a competitive level playing field. But very much our events are close to shore stadium racing, as we call it. So, once upon a time sailing, I understand from the Valencia America's Cup in 2010, the hospitality boats had to sail off an hour before the race to go and watch it miles offshore. But very much our races are close to shore and are in the grandstands along the shoreline, as well as hospitality being along the shoreline. And you're able to see and interact with the entire race, as well as having the big screen, which shows the graphical overlay that I referred to earlier. So that's very much in our DNA that this is close to shore stadium racing. And really, we encourage our fans to come along and have fun by the water. And I think that's one of our USPs. There's not many sports properties that have that proximity to water and in pretty iconic locations. So that's something that we pride ourselves on. And yeah, as I'd say today, we also feature the best athletes in the sport. And that's been something that we've grown over time. Wasn't always the case in season 1, for example. We were more of a growing sport, but yeah, I certainly think that's an advantage of ours over certainly other sports properties that we have the best of the best in this sport competing on a level playing field. And so yeah, it's certainly something that we will look to continue to aspire to within SailGP. So I guess that's the kind of core overview of what SailGP is.
Yeah. When you say the catamarans are the same, is that like there's parameters and they can build within them, or is it that is the exact same car? Or sorry, the
Yeah.
exact boat?
Well, you say car. I mean, look, we certainly consider ourselves to be a racing property.
Mhm.
This is racing ultimately. There's 12 boats on the start line, they cross the finish line. It's pretty easy to understand, which has not always been the case in sailing. Yeah, to answer your question, there are settings that the teams can tweak, but that they have the same kit in that the components are all the same. But yeah, they can change the setting to sail the boat. They can sail and the foiling above the water. Some teams like it to be a little bit higher. Some teams like to be lower in the water. So there's definitely elements that they can change. And the other cool thing about SailGP is that all the teams see each other's data, so they all know what other teams are doing. And that again can almost like the rich don't get richer. The teams at the bottom of the table can level up here and they can be more competitive straight away because they see what the best teams are doing and they can emulate that on their boat. But even then, with their same equipment, our races are 15 minutes, or probably less than that now, 12, 13 minutes, and deliberately so, by the way. I could come on to that. But yeah, even then, some of the teams are finishing 2.5 minutes behind the first team, even though they've got having the same equipment. So it does go to show how important it is that in this sport, certainly in my view and probably Russell's view, you can't have different gear, because if you have different gear, the team with the best equipment is going to win kind of 9 times out of 10, and that doesn't create an interesting spectacle in our view.
Yeah, yeah. The reason I said car was because I was going to ask you, using an analogy, would it be the same as basically saying in F1, everyone's going to drive the same car, but they can obviously change the driver setup slightly
Yeah,
if they want
yeah,
to.
yeah. That's a great analogy for sure. And I know over time, in Formula One, they've introduced budget caps, and
Mhm.
I guess the cars are getting closer together.
Yeah.
And obviously we've seen in recent weeks that kind of, I guess, Arca Rebel Racing won over the weekend, but McLaren are looking good this year. So yeah, I guess Formula One are probably trying to get a more competitive field. But yeah, we've had that from day one, and we think it makes a more compelling product for sure.
Yeah, because from a competitive balance perspective, I guess the only way you can really judge a driver is how they compare versus the second driver on their team, because they're the only two that are in the same car. Whereas I guess in SailGP, it really is a test of skill of the sailors.
Yeah.
They're all in the same. They're all using the same equipment.
Yeah, for sure. And look, there's six of them on board as well. So, there's different areas. It's not just the driver, the wing trimmer. The wing trimmer is effectively powering the boat up and down, almost like on the accelerator button. And then
Mhm.
you've got kind of flight control that's controlling the ride height of the boat out of the water. So, there's a number of different roles on the boat that have to work in unison. So it's equivalent to, a Formula One driver not having their accelerator or brake button and someone else doing that for them. That's almost kind of what we have on our boat. So yeah, it's certainly the ultimate test of skill in our view.
Yeah, and in terms of like you mentioned earlier about to go on holiday, and then you get asked to create a commercial plan with 2 days. Like, how much has that commercial plan changed, that kind of first evolution of it that you, I guess, put together with Russell and Larry?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's gone quicker than we expected, which is good. In terms of, I guess you're pointing out almost like the commercial matrix or the split, not dissimilar than what we considered. I guess the model was put together during COVID. Sorry,
Yeah.
before COVID, I should say. COVID happened, and then I think some things changed in the industry. I think there was certainly we saw that there was a groundswell of host venues looking for events after COVID. That certainly helped that revenue line. But look, I think we knew based on our experience of the America's Cup, where the kind of main revenue streams were going to come from, predominantly sponsorship. But yeah, I guess over time we've certainly got to a position earlier in our life where ticket sales is now a pretty significant revenue stream for us. If you have seen our New Zealand event in Auckland, we had over 25,000 people at that event, and that's probably earlier than we expected to be, into significant ticket sales. So that was something that was certainly not expected at this point. And then I think the other thing I'd say, which we'll probably come on to, is uh, team sales. There's been an explosion of that, and I think that's probably indicative of the broader market, in that there seems to be a groundswell of interest in sports teams, certainly in emerging sports, and I think that was something that we probably hadn't factored in early on. But in general, I think, yeah, as I say, we've gone a lot quicker than that first sketch two-pager kind of was put together. But at the same time, I think you change things along the way. I think what we've also done is add more events and more teams than we expected to in those early days. In that, there's been more demand for events and more events and demand for teams, and we've been in a fortunate position that we've been able to do that. Again, that kind of accelerates that growth earlier than we expected.
Yeah. So in terms of setting off, yeah, you said more events and more teams. What did it start as when you first launched? And you mentioned now it's 13 locations, 12 teams, right? So how's that kind of progressed over the years?
Yeah, very different to what it was to begin with. We started off with 5 events in season one, and we had 6 teams.
Okay.
And we got to the end of that season, we were like, wow, that was tough.
Mhm.
Which it was. So, you're getting a whole sports league off the ground. And we got to end it thinking, wow, we'll probably do the same again next year. And then COVID hit. And I think COVID hit at probably a good time for us in that we could review how we could really look into how we'd performed in season one. I don't think we'd performed badly, but we probably didn't have the right number of events, nor did we have the right number of teams to create a commercially compelling product. And that's certainly been our focus for the last 4 seasons. How do we invest in our product? How do we make a better product? And that's certainly been something that around our organization everybody is clear on. And so over time we've increased the number of events. I think season two, I think we had 8. I'll probably get it wrong, but 8 teams and 8 events. Season four, we had 10 teams and 11 events. I want to say it might have been 12. And now we're up to 12 teams and 13 events. I think, we'll probably look to increase that. But, obviously logistics is a limiting factor for sure. It's obviously, there's the expense of growing too quickly. We've been cautious that we haven't wanted to grow too quickly along this journey. That's the other thing that these are almost a trap you can fall into. But yeah, we'll probably look to get up to more like 15, 16 events is probably where we'll get to. And then we certainly believe that there's room for more teams. We're looking at kind of the ways that we can tweak our format now to almost like have 2 groups of teams still competing on the same weekend, by the way, but almost like have 2 heats of perhaps 8 teams that kind of go off against each other, and then you get to a final, which we think will be pretty interesting for the fans to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think about there's a few different ways we could go from here, but I think one bit that stands out to me is like you talk about the team ownership. First off, I think one thing that's quite interesting that you've done, which is very hard for challenger leagues, is to create fandom from day one. But you've attached the teams to geographic locations, which I guess helps with that because people can immediately be like, "Oh, I'm going to support the British team with Ben Ainsley, or I'm going to support the French team, or I'm going to support the US team," right? So I think that helps. Like you've seen like other challenger leagues where they try to create brands from scratch, Live Golf, for example, which I think you're starting to get familiar with the brands, but it takes a bit more time because they're completely new, right? There's no history, there's no attachment when they first launch. So I think that's interesting. I wonder, like, is that a strategy that will continue as you expand, or will you start to be like, oh, actually, we could have 2 British teams, or we could have 2 American teams?
Yeah, I mean, look, you bang on with your assessment. You get a fan base straight away if you have a national affiliation. You kind of see it at all our events. The kind of local crowd are hyped up to watch their team. We've got an event in Rio in a few weeks' time, and I'm sure it'll be a partisan Brazilian crowd cheering on that team. And yeah, I think you know over time we'll see how that develops. You might have seen that we've I guess given title rights to partners, which is kind of part of the team commercial model. So the British team now is Emirates GBR, the Danish team is Rockall Racing. We will see how it develops. I think there'll always be a national affiliation, that's for sure, but it's kind of how that manifests itself is something that we can play with. And going back to your earlier point, we kind of have the luxury of doing that because we don't have a ton of governance above us. But yeah, it's certainly if you look at other leagues, they're almost kind of going back and saying, how do we get a national affiliation? But I think the challenge with national affiliation is how do you get your big transfer stories?
Yeah.
How do you get your Lionel Messi going into Miami, for example? How do you do that? And we have kind of relaxed the nationality rules in recent times to allow that kind of that transfer market to open, which is actually we started to have transfer fees between teams, which is the first time in sailing history that's happened. So that's interesting. That's an interesting development for our teams for sure. So yeah, I think we'll continue down this path for some time. The biggest thing for me is, and I'm sure lots of kind of new sports properties have this, is how do you give people a reason to care? And it's kind of I care about watching the Premier League because I was brought up in a certain place, and you always have that reason to care. And if you watch England play cricket, you kind of I care about that because I've always been brought up for the England. We need to support England. Some similar with football, but I think obviously the national affiliation gives you that straight away. But then for me, it's like, how do we kick on from there? And how do we give people reasons to care about the athletes and, the kind of actual sport itself? So that's really the next step for us.
Yeah. And is team ownership one of the strategies there? Because I mean, a bit of news that came out fairly recently was that Kylian Mbappe was part of one of the ownership groups that's bought into the French team. Um,
Yeah.
obviously, fans reach into a new audience that maybe aren't familiar with sailing.
Yeah, definitely that helps for sure. It's interesting actually. When we set up SailGP, we originally had it down to be almost like a franchise league. As a reference, Larry Ellison is American, and that's kind of his, yeah, I guess, knowledge of the sports industry. I mean, he has a vast knowledge of the sports industry, but it's in the NFL, the NBA. Those are the leagues that have worked. When we set up SailGP, kind of, we had other stakeholders in the room, and yeah, we're like, oh, brilliant, this will be a franchise league, and we'll all go together and come by. Oh, this is going to be brilliant. But it soon materialized that you know everybody had different points of view in the room, and it was clear that and I think, as Larry said, you wouldn't operate your business in that way. So again, it goes back to the point I made around committees earlier. You can't run this new sports league by committee, in our view. So I guess we kind of took on all the teams early on. We were fortunate enough to do so. And we kind of said, look, if you want to buy a team off us, then come along in the future. And yeah, I think we've been doing it carefully through the years. I think we didn't have the luxury of, say, the 100, where, it's a pretty well known sport in cricket, of course. And, they could run a bid process that they've successfully done, and then hats off to them for sure. I think we had to be a bit more careful about how we did it, and as we grew, we were kind of almost, inbound traffic came in as well as some light outbound traffic, and yeah, each year we've probably sold off two or three, and we've kind of getting to the end of that hybrid model now, and should be all of our teams should be in third party hands likely by the end of this season. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, yeah, Kylian Mbappe, it's great to have him. He has a huge reach. What we've been very careful to do is for these things not to just be marketing stunts.
Yeah.
And obviously there's the revenue from from people buying teams for sure, which is helpful. But certainly we found that if, I guess, celebrities or so forth come into sports teams, they really need to have skin in the game to make it work. And so, Killian came in, he invested money, he's really interested in where the team as LGP can go. So, it was very important for us to have an authentic connection with Killian, and we do through the Accor Group, who are also one of the owners of that French team. So, yeah, it's definitely, look, there is a groundswell of, I guess, celebrities and sports stars who, have accumulated money and that they want to invest. So, yeah, it's certainly a method, and we'll look at other proposals as they come up. But I wouldn't say it was a concerted strategy that we have to have these celebrities because they're going to help us. But certainly, it was a kind of a nice byproduct of the process we were running, and we are kind of, I guess, fortunate in timing that there are individuals who are looking for these type of investments.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few other questions I guess we could talk about from the team structure perspective. Like, for example, if you're going to expand to more teams, I guess one element of the franchise model that really kind of increases the value of them is the scarcity, right? Like the reason that people want to buy into NBA or
Yeah.
others, partially because there's only a certain amount of teams, right? So that drives a lot of the value. So is there some sort of reassurance, I guess, with the current team owners that it won't go above a certain number?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it's quite a hot topic right now, Andy, I'll be honest. You've kind of hit on something that we are in discussions with. Look, what I'd say is that there's almost a natural limit in that there's only so many boats we can get on the race course.
Mhm.
Similarly in Formula One, I guess, there's only so many cars you can have on the track, right? And obviously there's two cars per team in that scenario. But yeah, we certainly think that 20 is probably our limit today. And thereafter, there's probably not enough space. As I referred to earlier, how we split into leagues, it's something that I think that the format will evolve to, albeit always competing on the same weekend. But the advantage it has for us in that we set up our franchises in national teams
Yeah.
is that straight away, you get as we talked about, referred to before, you get a active fan base in that market that you add. So having Italy and Brazil this year, all of a sudden Kelsa Prix is, the broadcast numbers are, up in those two markets. The digital numbers are up in those two markets. So yeah, it's actually, yes, you make a good point about scarcity, but also the other team owners also have a vested interest in, new markets because that expands their reach. If you look at our lineup right now, I guess it's European, Australasian, and North American focused. We just added a South American team this year in Brazil, but there's a lack of Asian teams right now, and that's certainly something that we'd be looking at over the coming years. Equally, that we don't have any Middle Eastern teams at the moment, so that's a huge market for us, given that we have events in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So there's certainly, I guess what I'm saying is, as a sports entity, our view is you don't want to kind of close yourself off because you kind of get yourself in trouble down the line. And you referred to the NBA there; they've got 32 teams, and we've got 12. So we're a long way off that. Of course, we aren't the NBA, but I think there is room to grow.
Yeah. And then for those team owners, when you look at it from a commercial perspective, you've talked on about a few of the revenue lines for the league. There's ticket sales, there's the team sales, there's maybe host cities paying some sort of fee to host in certain markets.
Yep.
Broadcast rights, I imagine, is one, but one that stood out because of a couple of announcements that you've made in recent weeks and months is the sponsorship side of things. So, Rolex coming on board as a title partner. A lot of the other brands that you have on board are also kind of what you consider kind of blue chip tier one brands, right? If it's Accor, Emirates, Cognizant, DP World, like they're all big organizations. What is it that kind of attracts those brands to you, and how have you kind of gone about approaching that?
Yeah, I think with Rolex, we were really fortunate that we kind of came to each other at the right time. That they've been in sailing for a number of years, and it works well for them as a sport. And they were looking for something innovative in the world of sailing. And kind of, we were fortunate enough to announce when we started with Rolex already signed up as a partner. And I think we're hugely privileged to have them on board now as our title partner. And in my view, that's very much a coming of age for us as an organization. And we do understand we have a responsibility to uphold those brand values of Rolex, but I think that pushes us on quite nicely as an organization. And I think we've carefully built a sponsorship proposition that works for those kind of blue chip partners that you referred to. I think we were nicely, I guess, positioned alongside tennis and golf in that cohort of sports. And I think, again, we're very proud that we're rubbing shoulders with some of those major championships now and competing for sponsors with them. I think really, on the commercial side, we've definitely punched above our weight, and I'll expand upon that. I think, as a new property, you can definitely provide a more bespoke set of rights for partners, certainly at the global level, and we've been able to do that with our packages. I think, we've been able to tailor hospitality experiences that work for our partners. Certainly, B2B experiences high on many of our partners' lists. And I think we've been able to, I guess, curate content and other forms of rights that have really enabled those partners to activate in a right way. So, I think we've also, as you referred to earlier, built a valuable audience that is certainly attractive for these type of partners. I think the next step for SailGP as an organization is how do we deliver a more significant audience? And that's something over the next 5 years that is certainly top of our agenda, and something that we'll look to deliver for those partners. But I think, as I say, highly curated, bespoke commercial packages has really been the way that we've been able to deliver our goals in the sponsorship world.
Yeah. And then how does that split amongst the league and the teams? Does that, like, for example, with someone like Emirates that's a partner with SailGP, I assume you then are the reason that they get involved in the GB team, but then that's a commercial deal that they've done separately with the team. Is that right?
Yeah, it was actually the other way around in that instance, and
Okay.
Emirates partnered with the GBR team, and then yeah, that they kind of saw that there were other rights that were available to them within the league that they were able to go and grab, and look, to answer your question, I guess the teams have their rights to their boat and those assets, and obviously their own social channels and the content that they do themselves. And then the league obviously has the broadcast assets and the event assets. And so, yeah, I think a number of our partners, obviously the teams obviously have access to the athletes as well. It's pretty key to our partners. So I think many of our partners like a bit of both. And I think we're seeing that across the sports industry, and that, you know, sponsors are aligning to teams to get that access to athletes and the team, but also a broader set of rights in the league. And yeah, it's the same with Accor. They partnered with our French team originally,
Mhm.
and then they kind of looked at other assets that they wanted. And again, it's an advantage of being a new property, right? In that we have those assets that are available today. That might not be the case in the future. But yeah, it's definitely been a model that has worked for us. I guess conversely, Mubadala came in as a global partner in season three. Again, I guess that they wanted an asset that they could own too within our league. So they're the title partner of our Brazilian team today, and that works for them too. So yeah, I guess it's not been a concerted strategy, but it's almost
Yeah.
something that's evolved over time.
Yeah. Two of those brands in Emirates and Accor are like really well known for, well, I guess airlines and hotels in general are just very well known for having good data, right? Like good loyalty programs and being able to like collect a lot of data on audience. As a sort of newer league, do you think you punch above your weight in terms of like having a really good understanding of your fan base?
Yeah, I think we're forensic with our analysis, as you'd expect us to be, given that our boats have about 6 billion data points that come off them. So, we have a pretty strong data science team internally at SailGP. One area works on the boat side of things, and then the other works on the commercials. So, yeah, we certainly analyze our audience, and we compile as much data as we can, and that's certainly compelling for partners when you can be clear who your audience is, right? And that's not always the case. But yeah, it's certainly getting broadcast data isn't always the easiest, as you'll probably be aware. But we at least get the viewership figures, and we get some kind of demographics. But I think our next goal is how we build out our own CRM.
Yeah.
And yeah, giving a plug to our sponsor here, Oracle, and us do a lot of work together on that. But yeah, it's really how we're encouraging fans to sign up. Why do I need to sign up to the SailGP database? Obviously it's for tickets, it's for giveaways, and all those other good things. So yeah, that gives you, I guess, the people who come on site, and the people who sign up to your database obviously give you the most rich data. And then it's about having a team centrally to analyze it, because the data is only so good as the analysis you can do. So yeah, it's certainly something that we have focused on in these early years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, last question, because I appreciate we're getting towards the end of the hour. So you mentioned CRM being one focus point for you. If you were going to sort of highlight one or two other areas that you're particularly focused on right now, um, what would they be and why?
Yeah, good question. I'll answer this in two parts, if I may.
Sure.
I certainly think consistency is now a key for us as an organization. And in that, I mean, it's all very well and good increasing the number of events that you have, unless you have a consistent calendar that A, the fans know is coming, and B, the broadcasters know is coming and the sponsors know is coming. It's quite tricky as an organization to grow. And so we're almost putting a metric on ourselves that, we want to make sure that the events we have in season 5 are going to be very similar to the events in season 6, and so on. And that sounds super basic, but as a organization that's been growing significantly, it's not something that we've been able to do. And, COVID came out of COVID and we're kind of like in a split year, which didn't help us. And so really kind of focusing on that calendar, nailing that down and doing long-term deals with host venues in iconic locations is really key for us, frankly, as an organization. And, having, 80% of those cities exactly the same at the same time next year is key. But that all ladders up to audience.
Yep.
It's kind of, I think what we've focused on in these first 5 seasons is how can we build our product? How can we build a compelling sports property? How can we make sure that this is, a interesting product for fans? And Russell, our CEO, is meticulous in that he reviews every broadcast and he really gets into the detail. I mean, you'd be surprised how many rights holders actually watch their broadcast. But Russell sends us a long list of notes after every broadcast, which is great, and it kind of he's kind of the visionary of the sport. He knows the sport better than anyone, so he's trying to make sure that others can understand it in the same way that he can. So, yeah, it's really how do we now grow that audience from the point we've got ourselves to. And I think we're kind of averaging about 25 million dedicated viewers on linear and digital for each race, but now it's time for us to kick on from there. It's something we're looking at all angles. How do we grow our digital channels? Certainly TikTok has been a huge success story for us, and that's obviously at a much younger demographic. So that's I think we've got 500,000 followers on TikTok today. I think we've got 1 million YouTube subscribers now. So, we are starting to attract a younger audience now. 500,000 TikTok followers is great in the world of sailing, but really it's like, how do we now competing to get, 2-3 million TikTok followers? So those are the type of things that we're focusing on. I think, everyone in the sports industry, and, I get told this all the time, oh, why don't you just do a Drive to Survive type thing? And you think, well, yeah, I wish it was easy as that. It's not as, it's not as simplistic as that. Obviously you need a product that the likes of Netflix and co, add subscribers as a result. And, it's certainly an area that we're looking very closely at, and really kind of trying to understand, well, what's the next thing in that genre. And I think that will develop over the years. So yeah, in a nutshell, consistency, audience growth is really what we're looking for here.
Nice. That's a great place for us to wrap up for today, and really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing these insights.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Pundit podcast. I'll include more info about the guest and the topics covered in the show notes. And you can also find my LinkedIn profile if you'd like to connect and let me know what you thought. Visit sportspundit.co to find previous editions of the podcast, access the newsletter, and to sign up for our WhatsApp group and see upcoming social events in cities around the world. See you again soon.